2,000 British soldiers stepped forward in perfect order. They were veterans, men who had marched through Europe, men who had stood in lines under cannon fire and kept moving, men who had watched entire armies break and had not been among them. They wore red coats that had seen real war. Across the field, fewer than 700 Americans waited. No grand formation, no drums, no shining ranks. Just men standing behind a wooden fence. The British officers saw the numbers and smiled. This was exactly the kind of fight they understood. Open ground, a clear objective, a thin enemy line that would collapse under pressure. They had done this before. They had done it against better armies than this. What they did not see was the ground beneath their feet. They did not see the ditch running just beyond the fence. They did not see how the soil had been cut and shaped. They did not see how every yard of open space had already been measured. They saw farmers, frontiersmen, militia. They saw an obstacle that would slow the Americans down when the real fighting began. What they did not see was that the fighting had already been decided, because this was not a battle that would be won by courage. It would not be won by numbers, and it would not be won by experience earned on European fields. It would be decided by one simple fact. Only one side understood where they were standing. And when the British veterans finally moved forward, confident, disciplined, unstoppable, they would discover that the fence in front of them was not protection, it was a weapon. And by the time they realized that, there would be no way to stop what was coming next. This would not be remembered as a lucky stand. There would be no last-second miracle, no heroic charge at the final moment, no sudden collapse caused by chance. What happened here was planned, not in a tent the night before, not in a hurried council of officers, but slowly, over days, by men who understood something their enemy did not, because the British believed they were walking into a familiar battle. The Americans knew they were building a trap. Every step taken across that field would matter. Every yard would cost blood. Every decision, where to stand, when to fire, when not to move, had already been made long before the first musket was raised. And that is why this fight would end so quickly. Not because one side lacked courage, not because one side ran, but because one army came to fight a battle, and the other came to end it. By the time the smoke cleared, military observers across the world would struggle to explain how an army that large, that experienced, that confident could simply stop, how veterans of Europe could be frozen in place, how momentum could die in open ground, how discipline could turn into confusion in a matter of minutes. The answer was not a single moment. It was a series of choices, invisible at first, that turned certainty into catastrophe. And it began with who the British believed they were facing, and who they believed themselves to be. These were not raw recruits. They were not men learning how to stand in line for the first time. They were not soldiers discovering fear on a battlefield. They were veterans of the greatest war Europe had ever seen. Many of them had fought in Spain and Portugal. They had advanced under French artillery. They had held formation while columns collapsed beside them. They had faced Napoleon's armies and survived. They believed in order, in precision, in the simple, brutal mathematics of disciplined men moving forward together. They believed that wars were won by momentum, that a steady advance broke weaker troops before the bayonet ever reached them, that once a line began to move, the enemy would fold. And for years, they had been right. They trusted their officers. They trusted their training. They trusted the doctrine that had carried the British Empire across continents. When they looked across that field, they did not see an equal opponent. They saw an army without uniformity, without polish, without the experience that mattered. Men behind a fence did not frighten them, because fences were obstacles, not defenses. Because militia broke, because irregulars fired once and ran. That was how this was supposed to go. The British would advance, the Americans would fire early, the line would hesitate, and then it would collapse. That expectation shaped every decision that followed. It shaped how the officers gave orders. It shaped how the men dressed their lines. It shaped how quickly they believed this would be over. What they did not consider, not for a moment, was the possibility that the enemy in front of them was not trying to stop them. They were trying to hold them, and that single misunderstanding would cost them everything. On paper, the Americans were not impressive. They were not an army that inspired caution. They did not carry a reputation that commanded respect across oceans. They did not arrive with the weight of empire behind them. Many were militia, men who drilled when they could, men who brought their own weapons, men who returned home when the season demanded it. Some had never stood in a formal line of battle. Some had never faced a bayonet charge. Some had never heard cannon fire at all. To European eyes, this was not a professional force. It was uneven, unrefined, unpredictable. Their uniforms did not match. Their equipment varied. Their backgrounds were scattered. Farmers, hunters, sailors, laborers, and worse. They were defending, not a fortress of stone, not a city wall, but a low wooden barrier in open ground. No high ground, no towering works, no obvious advantage. To the British, this looked like desperation. A thin line of men hiding behind a fence because they knew they could not survive in the open. The kind of defense built by an army that expected to break, an army hoping only to delay the inevitable. That assumption, more than any cannon or musket, would shape the next few minutes, because the Americans were not waiting for the British to come to them. They were waiting for them to commit, and once they did, there would be no retreat that could save them. This field was not the prize. It was the door. Beyond it lay a city that controlled the river. Beyond it lay the artery that fed an entire nation's interior. Beyond it lay the power to decide how this war would end and who would decide it. If the British broke this line, they would take New Orleans. If they took New Orleans, they would command the Mississippi. They would choke American trade. They would isolate the Western territories. They would negotiate from a position of strength. This was not a raid. It was not a demonstration. It was a decisive move. The British High Command believed that one hard strike here would undo everything the Americans had gained elsewhere. That control of this river would do what armies alone could not. And they were not wrong. Losing this position would not just mean losing a battle. It would mean losing leverage, losing momentum, losing the ability to dictate the peace. That is why the British advanced with confidence. They believed this field was the last obstacle between them and victory. What they did not understand was that this field had already been chosen as the place where their campaign would end, not because of the city behind it, not because of the river beside it, but because of the ground beneath it, and the men who had shaped it with intention. At first glance, the ground looked ordinary, flat, open, unremarkable, the kind of terrain officers preferred, clear lines of advance, no hidden threats, nothing that interfered with formation. But that was the illusion. The field sat between two dangers. On one side, the river pressed close, wide and cold, limiting movement and narrowing the approach. On the other, swampy ground swallowed anything that strayed too far from the center. There was no room to maneuver, no wide arc for flanking columns, no space to outstretch the line. Every man advancing would be funneled forward, compressed into a corridor of mud and grass, and the ground itself was unstable, soft soil that shifted underfoot, low areas that collected water, patches that looked firm until weight turned them into traps. This was not the solid earth European armies were used to marching across. It was land that resisted movement, land that punished order, land that rewarded those who stayed still. The fence at the far end of the field followed this logic perfectly. It was not high, it was not imposing, it did not scream fortification. It simply marked the point where movement would stop, and fire would begin. Every step forward made the British line more vulnerable. Every step backward made retreat more difficult. By the time they realized how narrow their world had become, there would be nowhere left to go. The fence did not appear by chance. It was not a hurried barrier thrown up in panic. It was not a last-minute attempt to slow the enemy. It was placed deliberately. The men behind it had been working for days, cutting, digging, shaping, not to build a fortress that looked impressive, but to create one that functioned perfectly. They studied the ground the way hunters study a clearing. They measured distance. They marked fields of fire. They decided exactly where the enemy would be most exposed. The ditch in front of the fence was cut just deep enough to break a charge, not deep enough to stop it, but deep enough to slow it. The fence itself was reinforced at firing height, not to shield bodies, but to steady weapons, and the line behind it was arranged with intention. Veterans placed where steadiness mattered most. Militia positioned where cover compensated for inexperience. Artillery positioned not for range, but for effect. To an approaching army, it looked passive. To the men who built it, it was aggressive. Every feature was designed to do one thing: hold the enemy in place while pressure built. Once the British committed to the advance, they would not be fighting men, they would be fighting geometry. And geometry does not care how brave you are. The night before the advance was quiet, not peaceful, but restrained. The air was heavy with moisture, cold enough to stiffen fingers, damp enough to cling to clothing and powder. Men lay awake listening. Some sharpened bayonets that would never be used. Some checked muskets again and again, knowing they would not fire first. Some stared into the darkness, measuring the distance they would soon have to cross. Orders were brief. There was no speech meant to inspire, no promise of glory, just instructions. Advance in line, maintain formation, do not break. Across the field, the Americans waited in silence. No movement, no fire, no signal that anything unusual had been prepared. From a distance, the position looked inactive, even weak. That was intentional. The men behind the fence had already accepted one thing: they would not move forward. They would not chase. They would not pursue. They would let the enemy come to them. As dawn approached, the fog clung low to the ground. It softened outlines, blurred distance, compressed depth. The field that had looked manageable in daylight now felt smaller, closer, more confined. When the light finally broke through the haze, the decision had already been made. The British line formed up. The order was given, and the field that had been silent for hours was about to erupt. The advance began without ceremony. No dramatic signal, no sudden rush. Just the steady movement of men stepping forward together, lines dressed, intervals checked, officers walking slightly ahead, swords low, eyes fixed on the fence. At first, nothing happened. The distance closed, slowly, too slowly. Each step forward narrowed the space behind them. Each step committed more men to the same strip of ground. The silence stretched, no shots, no warning fire. For a moment, it felt wrong. Some officers expected the Americans to fire early. Others expected them to run. Neither happened. The line continued forward. Boots sank into soft earth. Mud pulled at ankles. Formations tightened as men unconsciously moved closer together. Then finally, a single crack split the air. Not a volley, not a roar, just one shot. It was followed by another, and then another, measured, deliberate. The Americans were not firing to stop the advance. They were testing distance. British officers shouted for the line to keep moving. This was normal. This was expected. But as more shots followed, something became clear. The fire was not wild. It was not rushed. It was controlled. And it was coming from exactly where it was supposed to. To the British officers, this still looked manageable. The Americans were firing, but not in the volumes they expected. There was no desperate volley, no panicked discharge meant to frighten men away. That was reassuring. It suggested restraint. It suggested inexperience. It suggested an enemy trying to conserve strength because they lacked it. The advance continued. Commands were shouted down the line. Intervals tightened. Men stepped around fallen comrades without breaking stride. This was what discipline was for. This was what they had trained to endure. The fence grew closer. Officers began to imagine the next phase, the final rush, the bayonets, the collapse of resistance. Some units were already preparing to accelerate. From their perspective, the Americans were holding fire because they were afraid. What they did not understand was that the Americans were waiting for range, waiting for density, waiting for the moment when the line could no longer stop itself. When the British committed fully, they believed they were about to win. In reality, they had just stepped into the most dangerous part of the field. The change was immediate. What had been scattered fire became a wall of sound. Not one volley, but many, layered, overlapping. The Americans fired by design. Men behind the fence did not shoot at the same moment. They fired in sequence, one section, then the next, keeping the pressure constant. Muskets cracked in rhythm. Rifles picked targets deliberately. Cannons roared at distances measured days before. Grape shot tore through the compressed ranks. Not sweeping wildly, but cutting lanes. The ditch in front of the fence did its work. Men stumbled into it. Men behind them collided. Momentum collapsed into congestion. Officers tried to restore order. They shouted. They waved swords. They stepped forward to be seen. And they fell. The fire was not aimed at the mass. It was aimed at leadership. This was not how European battles were fought. This was not a line breaking under pressure. This was a line being held in place and dismantled. Every second the British remained in the open, the geometry worsened. More men pressed forward. Less space existed to move. And retreat, once possible, now meant crossing through the same killing ground in reverse. What had looked like a defense was now clearly an engine, and it was operating exactly as intended. Discipline can carry men through fear, but only for so long. The first sign was hesitation. Orders were given and repeated, but fewer men responded, not because they refused, but because they could not move. The ditch was full. Bodies blocked the way forward. Wounded men clung to those still standing. Those behind pressed on, unaware of what waited ahead. Smoke thickened. Visibility shrank to shapes and flashes. Commands were lost in the noise. Units began to drift out of alignment. Then the officers started to disappear, not gradually, but all at once. Men looked for guidance and found none. They looked for flags and saw them fall. They waited for commands that never came. The line did not break. It froze. Some soldiers dropped to the ground instinctively, seeking cover where none existed. Others stood uncertain, torn between advancing and retreating. And in that moment, when the forward motion stopped, the battle was decided. An army can recover from fear. It cannot recover from confusion. Behind the fence, the Americans did not advance. They did not shout. They did not chase. They simply kept firing. And with every second that passed, the space between the two armies filled with certainty. One side understood what was happening. The other no longer did. The first men turned back quietly, not in panic, not in flight. They simply stopped moving forward. They looked over their shoulders. They stepped sideways. They searched for a path that no longer existed. That hesitation spread. A unit stalled. Then another. Officers tried to regroup what remained. Drummers attempted to signal. Voices rose, not with commands, but with questions. The field offered no answers. The same ground that had forced them forward now trapped them in place. Those at the front could not retreat without climbing over the wounded. Those at the rear could not see what had gone wrong. Those in the middle were crushed by both. Then the line gave way. Not in one dramatic moment, but in fragments. Small groups broke off. Men began moving without orders. Formation dissolved into individuals. The retreat, once organized, became instinctive. Weapons were dropped to move faster. Standards were abandoned. The wounded were left where they fell. The fence remained still. The Americans did not surge forward to claim victory. They let the collapse happen. And within minutes, what had been a disciplined advance was no longer an army at all. When the firing stopped, the field was unrecognizable. The open ground that had looked so manageable at dawn was covered in stillness. Broken lines, abandoned equipment, men who would not rise. The British counted their losses slowly, not because the numbers were unclear, but because they were difficult to accept. Over 2,000 men were gone, killed, wounded, missing. Units that had crossed the field together no longer existed as formations. Across the fence, the count was brief. Fewer than 100 Americans had fallen, some wounded, some killed, most still standing where they had fired. The difference was not measured in bravery, it was measured in position, and it forced a realization that could not be ignored. This was not a close battle. It was an execution carried out by planning, patience, and ground. This outcome was not an accident. It was not the result of one bad order or one failed charge. It happened because two armies were fighting two different kinds of war. The British fought by doctrine. Their system was built for open fields, mutual visibility, and movement. It assumed both sides would advance. It assumed momentum would decide the outcome. The Americans fought by environment. They did not try to outmatch experience. They did not try to mirror formations. They did not try to win by movement. They removed movement entirely. The fence denied speed. The ditch denied cohesion. The narrow field denied flexibility. Every advantage the British brought with them was neutralized before it could be used. Discipline became rigidity. Experience became expectation. Confidence became commitment to a failing plan. The Americans did not need to defeat the British in combat. They only needed to prevent them from fighting the battle they understood. And once that happened, the result was inevitable. The loss could not be undone. The men could be replaced. The equipment could be resupplied, but the opportunity was gone. The British advance stalled permanently. The plan to seize the river collapsed with it. New Orleans remained in American hands. Control of the Mississippi stayed where it was. That single failure denied Britain the leverage it had sought. It denied them the bargaining position they believed this campaign would secure, and it changed how the war would be remembered. What should have been a decisive British victory became an American symbol. Proof that preparation could overcome experience. Proof that European methods did not always survive in American conditions. News of the battle traveled faster than its strategic details. What people remembered were the numbers, the veterans, the fence. And from that moment forward, this field was no longer just ground. It was evidence. Empires fight with rules. They rely on doctrine, on tradition, on the belief that what worked before will work again. Frontiers fight with reality. They use the ground. They use patience. They remove choices until only one remains. On this field, the British brought experience earned across Europe. The Americans brought understanding earned right here. 2,000 men marched forward believing they were unstoppable. 700 waited, knowing they didn't have to be. And when the smoke cleared, it was not courage that decided the outcome. It was positioning. Because in war, numbers matter. Training matters. Bravery matters. But none of it matters if you're fighting the wrong battle, on the wrong ground, against someone who already decided where you would lose.